After 11 years of trusting my accountant with everything, I learned he had kept 2 sets of books to quietly drain $640,000 from my bakery business and fund a lake house and a boat. My name is Marisol Vance, and before this happened, I believed I understood the people I trusted and the life I had built. The bank called me directly, bypassing my accountant entirely for the first time in 11 years, to ask why I was requesting a business line of credit increase when my company's own deposits, according to their records, showed a business generating barely a third of the revenue my own tax filings claimed. I sat in my office above our flagship bakery in Portland, Oregon, holding a phone in one hand and a profit and loss statement my accountant, Garrison Whitlock, had handed me not 2 weeks earlier in the other, 2 documents describing what were supposedly the same business, and understood, with a slow, sinking horror, that one of them was a lie. I'm 42 years old, and I founded Hearth & Crumb Bakeries 14 years ago with a single storefront and a family sourdough recipe, growing it over most of that decade into 4 locations across the Portland metro area employing 38 people. I did not inherit money. I did not marry into money. I did not have a line of investors waiting to write me checks when I had a good idea and a dream. I had a starter passed down from my Aunt Elena, a stubborn streak, a decent sense of flavor, and the willingness to wake up before dawn for years on end. My first shop was a narrow corner space with 1 oven, 2 mixers that sounded like they had been rescued from a scrapyard, and enough natural light to make me believe I could build something warm enough for people to feel at home in. In those early years, everything was done by hand or by instinct or by whatever I could learn in the margins of a day. I built the shelves myself. I painted the walls. I learned how to run payroll from a woman at the Small Business Association who spoke in patient, practical terms because she had the good sense to understand that a bakery owner can be brilliant at bread and still need help with a spreadsheet. When the business started to grow, the kind of growth that feels miraculous and dangerous at the same time, I knew I needed someone I could trust to handle the parts of the operation I couldn't keep doing alone. That was how Garrison Whitlock entered my life. He was recommended by another shop owner in my commercial district, a man who swore Garrison was careful, responsive, and a lifesaver for small businesses that needed more than a basic tax preparer. At the time, Garrison seemed almost reassuringly ordinary. He was soft-spoken, neatly dressed, and always exactly on time. He brought printed reports in clean folders. He used words like reconciliation and accrual and depreciation in a way that made me feel I was standing on the edge of a language I had never properly learned but was relieved to hear spoken fluently by somebody else. I gave him access to payroll, then to tax filings, then to daily account reconciliation because, as the business expanded, I was spending more and more of my time dealing with equipment failures, vendor shortages, hiring, food costs, and the endless, unglamorous logistics of keeping 4 locations stocked with enough flour, butter, eggs, and labor to open every morning. Garrison eventually became the person I called when I wanted to know whether we could afford a new oven, whether a manager bonus would put us in a dangerous cash flow position, whether I could take a slightly larger salary one year and then dial it back the next if we had a winter slump. He was, in every practical sense, the gatekeeper to the financial story of my own company. For 11 years, I had no reason to distrust him. That is the part that still embarrasses me, not because I think trust itself is shameful, but because I know how useful that trust was to him. He was not some obvious cartoon villain twirling his mustache in a back room. He was a fixture, a dependable person. He knew my children's names. He asked after my husband, Desmond, when he stopped by the office to bring me lunch or drop off forgotten keys. He sent quick texts before quarterly deadlines. He remembered which of my managers had just had a baby and which had been dealing with a sick parent. He was the kind of person who could fit into the ordinary machinery of your life so neatly that you stopped noticing where the machine ended and the person began. The bank call came on a Wednesday. I remember that because Wednesdays were usually a production day at the flagship bakery, and the smell of rye and sourdough drifted up through the floorboards into my office. I had a half-finished cup of coffee going cold beside a stack of invoices. A supplier email was open on my laptop. I was trying to decide whether we could switch to a different egg distributor after 2 weeks of inconsistent deliveries. Then the phone rang, and a loan officer named Denise asked if I had a minute to discuss a discrepancy in our records. At first, I thought it was routine. Banks ask questions. Businesses ask for credit. Numbers get checked. It sounded procedural. But then Denise said that my company's deposits, according to the bank's own records, did not align with the revenue picture reflected in the financial statement submitted with our recent loan review. She explained it slowly, and I made her repeat it twice because my brain kept trying to turn her words into something harmless. Maybe she was reading a wrong account. Maybe she had the wrong year. Maybe Garrison had submitted the wrong file by mistake. Maybe this was one of those annoying little administrative messes that small business owners have to untangle once in a while and then laugh about later. It was not that. When she gave me the numbers again, I felt my stomach drop in a way I can still feel if I think about it too hard. According to the bank, our deposits showed a business earning barely a third of what the profit and loss statement Garrison had handed me showed. Not a small difference, not a rounding issue, not a timing issue that would smooth out by the next statement. A chasm, a version of my own company that had been quietly rewritten so thoroughly I no longer recognized it. I asked Denise to send me the figures in writing. She said, of course. I thanked her in a voice that sounded normal enough to fool a stranger, and hung up before my hands started shaking visibly. I stood there for a long moment looking out the office window at the sidewalk below, watching customers move in and out with paper bags tucked under their arms, and the strangest thing about that moment was not panic. Panic came later. What came first was a kind of stunned, stupid disbelief that felt almost physically separate from me. I remember looking at the shelves behind my desk, at the framed family recipe in my mother's handwriting, at the note from our first ever catering client still pinned under a magnet on the corkboard, and thinking, no, this is not happening in this room, not to this business, not after everything. I did not call Garrison. I did not run downstairs and confront him. I did not even tell my office manager, though I wanted badly to tell someone just to hear another human being say the same words back to me and prove I was not misreading the situation. I went back to work for the rest of the afternoon on autopilot, approving a flower order, signing off on a repair invoice, answering 2 customer messages about custom wedding cakes, and then I went home and sat at the kitchen table long after our kids had gone to bed. Desmond was the first person I told. He was rinsing dishes when I came in, and I think he knew before I said a word that something was wrong because I had the kind of face people get when they have seen a wall crack and are trying to decide if they are imagining it. I told him about the bank call. I told him what Denise had said. I told him the numbers. He listened without interrupting, then asked the first question a sane person would ask. Was I sure there wasn't a mistake? It was not a dumb question. It was the right question. I said I hoped there was a mistake. I said I was going to find out before I accused anyone of anything. Desmond pulled out a chair and sat down across from me. He did not try to solve it immediately. He did not try to minimize it either. He just stayed there while I called the bank back, wrote down the exact figures, and called a friend from our local business network who knew a forensic accountant. He stayed there through all of it, steady and quiet, the way he had been steady and quiet through the years when we had to make hard decisions about payroll, equipment purchases, and whether to expand into a second location when the first shop finally started to overflow with regulars. At that table, with the house dark around us and the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, I made the first decision that mattered. I would not confront Garrison until I understood the full scope of what was wrong. That decision was harder than it sounds. Every instinct in me wanted to storm into his office the next morning and throw the bank statement across his desk. But I had spent enough years as a business owner to know that people who steal and lie professionally are often very good at buying themselves time. If Garrison was manipulating records, then confronting him too early could give him exactly the opening he needed to alter files, shred paper, move money, delete access, or simply walk away from the whole thing before I understood how much damage had been done. So I hired an outside forensic accountant. Her name was Priscilla Nakamura, and she came recommended by an attorney friend of mine who told me, with unusual seriousness, that if there was any chance this was fraud, I needed someone meticulous, independent, and completely outside my usual orbit. Priscilla was not chatty. She did not waste words. She had the kind of calm that makes you believe she has seen every disaster 100 times and is still capable of taking the next step in order. I liked her immediately, which in that moment felt less like liking and more like the relief of finding a person whose competence could stand in the same room as my fear. We set up a limited, discreet review. Officially, it was a routine third-party financial check ahead of a possible expansion. Garrison was told only what he needed to know, which was very little. I kept my expression neutral whenever he sent over reports or stopped by the office. I signed things when I needed to. I asked ordinary questions. I continued to behave like a woman who had no reason to suspect that the floor beneath her had been cut out and painted over. Those first 3 weeks were some of the longest of my life. I kept waiting for the universe to hand me a simple explanation. A software glitch, an account mapping error, a deposit timing issue. Something that would let me laugh at myself later for overreacting. Instead, Priscilla's first findings confirmed the discrepancy and made it worse. Garrison's books did not match the bank records. That much was clear almost immediately. More disturbing was how deliberate the mismatch appeared to be. This was not sloppiness. It was architecture. He had been maintaining two sets of books. One set was accurate. That set showed the actual revenue, actual expenses, actual payroll, actual cash position. The other set was the one he showed me, the bank, and the tax preparer, and it had been carefully massaged to understate income in some categories while inflating certain expenses in others. The effect was subtle enough to hide a pattern of money moving out of our operating accounts. It made the business look less profitable than it was, which meant any unusual withdrawal or transfer could be justified as necessary, ordinary, or unfortunately unavoidable. I read Priscilla's summary 3 times before the words started to sink in. My first reaction was not even rage. It was a sick, embarrassed feeling, as though I had somehow failed a test I did not know I was taking. I had prided myself on knowing my business. I knew ingredient costs, labor schedules, foot traffic, seasonal demand, oven maintenance, vendor lead times, customer patterns, and the tiny emotional geography of each location. I could tell when one storefront was having a rough week by the way the staff moved around in it. I could tell when a neighborhood was changing because of what people ordered, how long they lingered, whether they asked for extra seating, or less music, or more vegan options. Yet somehow, in the middle of all that hard-earned operational awareness, I had let a man steer the financial story for 6 years without checking whether the map matched the territory. The shame was brief. The anger was longer. Priscilla moved carefully. She did not speculate. She followed the money. She showed me where the transfers had gone, how vendor payments had been disguised, and how shell entities had been set up with names just plausible enough to pass casual scrutiny. Some of the companies were variations of Garrison's own name. One was a fake bookkeeping software vendor that looked legitimate if you glanced too fast. None of them had actual employees or real operations. They existed to hold the money long enough for it to be moved again, and again, until it eventually surfaced in places no baker in Portland would ever think to look. It took nearly 2 months for the full trace to come together. 2 months of Priscilla digging through statements, invoices, transfer histories, tax filings, and ownership records. 2 months of me continuing to show up to work, to manage my stores, to answer staff questions about schedule changes and supplier delays and cake orders, all while carrying the knowledge that somebody inside my own business had been slowly siphoning off money I had spent years earning. There were moments in that period when I wanted to stop looking, not because I wanted to protect Garrison, but because I wanted the possibility that the truth might somehow be smaller than it was. Every new file Priscilla opened seemed to stretch the wound wider. There was money used to help fund a lake house in the Columbia River Gorge. There was money used for a boat. There were transfers hidden so neatly in our books that I felt insulted by their cleanliness. The scheme was not chaotic. It was patient. It was funded by the confidence that no one was looking closely enough. The deepest blow came when Priscilla showed me the time period that had hit my own life the hardest. 3 years earlier, we had gone through a brutal winter. Sales dipped. A dishwasher at one location quit without notice. One of our ovens needed emergency repairs. A supplier increased prices in the middle of a contract dispute. Garrison showed me numbers that made the business look precarious. He said we could stay afloat, but only if I held back on taking my full salary and delayed a few non-essential benefits and healthcare changes until the spring. It sounded miserable but possible. It sounded like a sacrifice that would protect the long-term health of the business. So I did it. I tightened my own belt. I put off medical appointments. I watched my own paycheck shrink. I told Desmond we would manage. We trimmed family spending where we could. We waited out the winter, and now Priscilla was showing me that the business had never actually been in the danger Garrison described. The numbers had been manipulated to create scarcity where there was none, so I would accept less while he continued pulling money out of the company in the background. I had sacrificed my own income and delayed my own care to protect a business that was healthier than I had been allowed to believe. I remember sitting at the kitchen table that night with the timeline spread out in front of me, staring at the columns and dates and trying to do the math. I could feel my pulse in my throat. Desmond made tea and set it beside me untouched. I did not cry. I felt like tears would be too easy. What I felt was colder than that, and cleaner, a focused anger, almost clinical in its sharpness. If Garrison had thought the numbers would conceal him forever, then he had underestimated the part of me that could spend years building a bakery from 1 storefront to 4. That is not the same thing as saying I was calm. I was furious. I was nauseated. I had stretches of the day where I would be standing in a hallway between the kitchen and the office, and suddenly feel the need to grip the wall because my body had remembered a fact my brain was still trying to organize. But anger can be a useful fuel when it is disciplined. Instead of erupting, I made a list. Priscilla would finish the full trace. I would keep the stores running normally. We would not alert Garrison. We would not let him know how much we knew until we were ready to move in one day, all at once. Once we had enough evidence, I brought in an attorney. His name was Cornelius Akubi. He specialized in business fraud litigation, and he had the same quality Priscilla had. He spoke like someone who did not need to impress you because he was already busy solving the thing in front of him. He reviewed Priscilla's initial findings, then asked the kind of questions that made me trust him more. How long had Garrison had signatory access? What software did he control? Who else saw monthly statements? Had I ever personally reviewed bank reconciliations, or had I relied entirely on his summaries? Could we prove intent, not just discrepancy? He did not sugarcoat the answer. Yes, we had a strong case if the paper trail held. Yes, the dual book system suggested deliberate fraud, not clerical error. Yes, restitution might be recoverable, but probably not all of it. Yes, the criminal side could take time. No, I should not tip Garrison off before the civil and criminal actions were filed. I did not like being told to wait. I knew he was right. Cornelius and Priscilla worked in parallel while I kept my daily life as normal as possible. That meant showing up to my Thursday afternoon financial review meetings with Garrison, as though the numbers on his report still meant what he claimed they meant. It meant listening to projections I knew were massaged. It meant nodding when he spoke in that soft, practiced voice of his, explaining margins and inventory variances and seasonal trends like the local business oracle he had convinced himself he was. It meant hearing him ask about my children's science fair projects, about Desmond's mother, about whether I had taken any time off that summer, all while I was sitting there knowing he had spent years hollowing out my company for his own benefit. I do not know how I kept my face still. Maybe it was shock. Maybe it was self-preservation. Maybe it was the fact that once you have a real purpose, the body can do remarkable things even when the mind is shaking. I remember one meeting in particular when Garrison had spread a set of quarterly projections across the conference table and said, in a tone of cheerful caution, that we should avoid being overly ambitious with staffing increases because cash flow remained a little tight. I nearly laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because the very phrase made me want to stand up and yell that he had no right to say the words cash flow in my building after what he had done to it. Instead, I asked a question about ingredient costs. He smiled and answered. That was the routine for 2 months. Me pretending, him performing competence, Priscilla quietly unspooling the threads, Cornelius preparing the legal structure. There were forms to gather, affidavits to sign, statements to preserve, and the kind of document review that makes time feel elastic because every page potentially matters. Priscilla eventually traced the diverted funds to just over $640,000. $640,000 is not an abstract number when you have lived with a bakery budget. It is ovens, payroll, rent, healthcare, equipment, and months of breathing room. It is the difference between taking a pay cut and being able to keep your own doctor's appointment. It is the scale at which theft stops being unfortunate and becomes a life event. Cornelius told me we would file the civil suit and the criminal referral on the same Wednesday morning. I asked to be the one to tell Garrison. He advised against it immediately. Not because he thought I would break down, but because he knew that any confrontation could give Garrison time to lawyer up, hide assets, or try to prepare a story. I understood all of that. I still wanted to look him in the eye when the truth landed. I wanted one moment where he had to sit inside the reality he had manufactured for me, even if only for a few minutes. Cornelius finally agreed on the condition that we do it in his office, with the evidence present and before anything became public. The morning we filed, I barely remember the traffic. I remember the sky being low and gray, the kind of Portland morning that makes everything feel more sealed in and quiet than it really is. I remember Priscilla carrying a thick folder that represented months of work. I remember Cornelius checking his watch and then closing the door after Garrison arrived. I remember Garrison looking mildly puzzled, then trying to turn that into his usual polite, professional expression when he saw the three of us seated around the conference table. He wore a blue shirt and a tie with a tiny geometric pattern. I remember that because at the time I had the absurd urge to notice ordinary details, maybe because the human brain likes to fix on nonsense when the truth is too large to hold at once. Cornelius began with the legal language. He explained that a forensic review had uncovered significant discrepancies. Priscilla slid the folder across the table and opened it in a way that was almost ceremonial. The first pages showed the twin book structures, the The next pages showed the shell entities. The next pages showed transfers. By the time we reached the asset trail, Garrison had gone very still. I had expected outrage. I had expected denial. I had expected him to lie in a loud, panicked way. Instead, he looked tired. Not remorseful. Not shattered. Just tired in a way that made me think he had spent years living one step ahead of himself. He asked how long we had known. I said 2 months. He nodded once, slowly, as though that answered a separate question he had already been asking himself. Then he asked, almost clinically, whether the bank had been the trigger. That startled me. It turned out he had learned about the bank call almost immediately. He had somehow heard enough to understand that something was wrong. Probably through one of the casual office channels fraudsters count on not being noticed. But by then I had continued business as usual, which meant he had gambled and lost, on the possibility that I had not understood the significance. He had been waiting to see whether I would move. I had. Just not in the direction he hoped. He did not confess in the dramatic sense people imagine when they think of fraud cases. He did not burst into tears or beg forgiveness or claim a momentary lapse in judgment. What he did was worse in its own way. He accepted the structure of the accusation without fighting the facts. He tried, at one point, to frame some of the transfers as advances or reimbursements or temporary bookkeeping adjustments. But Cornelius had already walked us through the proof. There was no legitimate explanation that could account for shell companies, false invoices, and 6 years of hidden money movement. The room was very quiet when it was over. I remember standing in the parking lot after he left with his attorney and feeling, for the first time in 2 months, that some part of my body had loosened. Not healed, not resolved, loosened. The worst part was no longer theoretical. It had a shape, it had a face, it had legal consequences now. Garrison was charged with first-degree theft and falsifying business records under Oregon law. The scale of the theft and the deliberate nature of the dual-book scheme made this a serious case. Cornelius told me not to expect anything quick. Criminal cases move slowly, especially when the defendant has enough money to hire defense counsel and enough incentive to drag things out. That proved accurate. Months passed. Statements were filed. Negotiations happened in quiet rooms I was not allowed to enter. Every step forward felt slightly less like justice than like a process, but process still mattered. The plea agreement came roughly 9 months later. By then, the forensic trail was so complete, and the shell entity record so strong, that trial was a losing game for his defense. Garrison pleaded guilty to first-degree theft, with the falsifying records charge folded into sentencing considerations. He was sentenced to 5 years, with the possibility of parole after 2.5. A restitution order was attached to the sale of the lake house and the boat. When those assets were liquidated, we recovered just under $400,000. I wish I could say that amount made me feel vindicated. It did not at first. The gap between what was taken and what came back still sat there like a missing tooth. Roughly $240,000 remained unrecovered. Cornelius had been honest about that from the start. He told me plainly that in cases like this, restitution rarely covers everything once assets are sold and legal costs, debts, and limited future earnings are accounted for. That was true, and it was annoying and deeply unfair, but it was also reality. I had spent enough time running a business to know that refusing reality does not make it more generous, so I made peace with the gap the way I made peace with most hard facts in business, by deciding what it would and would not get to control. The money mattered. $400,000 was enough to stabilize the company and rebuild reserves that had been quietly eroded without my knowledge. But the larger victory was not financial, it was informational. I finally knew what had happened. I knew where the money had gone. I knew how long the deception had lasted. I knew that the hardship I had felt for years had not always been the natural cost of growth or the inevitable volatility of running a bakery. Some of it had been manufactured by a man I trusted. When the case became public, the story moved through the local business community faster than I expected. Portland is not a giant city when you work in a network of independent owners, suppliers, managers, and vendors. People talk. It was a week after the arrest when I gathered my staff and told them the broad outline, because I did not want them hearing about it from a headline or a rumor thread. 38 people stood in my bakery office and in the hallway outside it, some of them looking worried, some angry on my behalf, some just stunned. I told them the truth as simply as I could. Garrison had been stealing from the company. We had uncovered it. The company's actual finances were sound. No one's paycheck was in danger. No one was being laid off because of this. The business would keep operating. We would be making some internal changes, but the stores were safe. That was when I saw the most moving part of the whole thing. Several of my employees looked like they had been holding their breath for days and were only just letting it out. One of our bakers started to cry. A cashier at our downtown location put both hands over her mouth and then sat down because her knees went weak. Some of them were angry in the way only loyal staff can be angry when someone outside the team has harmed the place they care about. They had all worked too hard for too long to be casual about the damage. The company was not a number to them. It was a routine, a livelihood, a set of familiar faces and obligations. Odalys Farrow, who had been running the original storefront for 9 years, waited until most people had filtered out, then asked me to come to her office. She closed the door and told me she had always thought Garrison was a little off, not overtly suspicious, just strange in a way she had never been able to place. He visited the store rarely, but when he did, he spent too much time looking at paperwork and not enough time talking to people. He seemed to enjoy sounding informed without actually seeing how the place worked. At the time, her comment felt like one more small piece dropping into a picture that was infuriating in hindsight because every piece now seemed obvious. That is one of the uglier things about betrayal. Once it is revealed, memory becomes hostile. You start replaying old interactions and seeing the warning signs that were too small, too ordinary, or too harmless to matter until they did. The weeks after the arrest were practical in a way that almost felt merciful. I brought in a new accounting firm within a month, one with a strict policy requiring dual sign-off on transfers over a modest threshold and monthly reconciliation reports sent directly to me. I also changed every access level I could, added internal controls, and made sure no one person could again control so many moving parts without oversight. Some of those changes were basic. That was the frustrating part. The fix for a 6-year fraud scheme was not some obscure technological miracle. It was visibility, it was redundancy, it was refusing to be lazy with trust. At first, those safeguards felt almost insultingly obvious. I was annoyed that it had taken a disaster to teach me to demand what should have existed from the beginning. But annoyance is a decent teacher if you let it be useful. I started talking to other small business owners about it when the subject came up. I told them to ask for monthly reports they actually read. I told them to separate duties where they could. I told them to make sure the person reconciling the accounts was not the only person seeing the accounts. Some people acted like I was overreacting. Most listened more carefully than I expected. Priscilla told me something after the case concluded that I have never forgotten. She said she had seen enough trusted bookkeeper fraud cases to recognize the pattern. It was rarely one giant theft. It was usually incremental, a small test, a harmless-looking discrepancy, a transfer that no one questions because business owners are busy and the books appear otherwise stable, then another, then another. Fraud grows in the space created by routine. It survives because most people are focused on their actual jobs, making the product, serving the customer, paying the staff, keeping the lights on. When she said that, I thought of all the mornings I had spent shaping dough before sunrise, all the afternoons I had spent calming a manager through a scheduling crisis, all the evenings I had spent doing family dinner logistics in the 10-minute gaps between emails. It was not that I was foolish, it was that I was busy in exactly the way a person running a real company is busy. Garrison knew that. He banked on it. Cornelius said something at the final settlement meeting that stayed with me for a different reason. He told me that the business owners who recovered most completely from fraud were not necessarily the ones who got the largest restitution checks. They were the ones who used the exposure to rebuild the structure, not just patch the hole. That meant better controls, clearer reporting, less concentration of authority, and a willingness to be the person who asks uncomfortable questions. He said, "Trust is not the enemy. Unchecked trust is." I have thought about that sentence more than once when I am reviewing monthly reconciliation reports in my office now. Because that is what I do now. I review them myself. It takes maybe 20 minutes. 20 minutes a month after 11 years of handing those numbers to someone else and assuming honesty would be enough. I read them line by line. I compare them against actual deposits. I check what changed and what did not. It is not glamorous. It is not dramatic. It is the smallest kind of protection. But that is what most real protection looks like. It is a habit you build before you need it. I still have the profit and loss statement Garrison handed me the day before the bank called. It is folded now, slightly creased from the day I put it in my jacket pocket and carried it home like a poison note. I could not yet read correctly. I keep it in a drawer in my office alongside the accurate version, Priscilla reconstructed. 2 documents describing the same years of my life in almost entirely different terms. One is polished enough to feel clean. One is honest enough to be ugly in places. I take them out sometimes not because I want to relive the betrayal, but because I want to remember that a lie can be formatted to look like truth if the person behind it has enough time, access, and confidence. That understanding changed more than my accounting practices. It changed how I think about expertise. I still value specialists. I still know when to call a lawyer, a mechanic, a doctor, a consultant. But I no longer confuse specialty with moral reliability. A person can speak fluently in the language of your weakness and still use that language against you. Garrison's competence was real. That was part of what made him dangerous. He knew enough to hide the theft inside numbers that looked respectable at a glance. He knew how to exploit the emotional side of being a business owner, the part that wants to believe the quiet person in the office with the clean folders has your best interests at heart. I also think differently now about what success cost me. For a long time, I believed every hard sacrifice in the business had been earned and transparent. We tighten belts in lean months. We skip bonuses when we have to. We delay personal plans for the sake of payroll. That is normal. But there is a difference between sacrifice and manipulation. I had sacrificed my own salary to protect a business that was already healthier than I had been told. That still makes me angry when I think about it. It also makes me grateful in a strange way that I did not know more than I did then, because if I had known and still chosen to stay silent, I would have had to carry a different kind of regret. My children know the story now in broad strokes. Not every legal detail, but enough to understand that sometimes adults you trust can behave badly, and that asking for clarity is not rude when the numbers do not make sense. I want them to grow up understanding that vigilance is not cynicism. I want them to know that checking the work is a form of respect for yourself. One of them asked me once why I still keep the old statement in the drawer if it makes me angry. I told her because anger can be useful if it keeps you from sleeping through the next lie. That answer made her laugh, which I took as a sign that at least some of my lessons are landing. The bakery itself has changed, but not in the ways outsiders would notice. The original corner store still opens before dawn. The croissants still sell too fast on weekends. The sourdough still comes out with the same crackling crust and airy interior that made us famous locally in the first place. Odalis still runs the flagship location with the same mix of discipline and warmth that has made her indispensable. We still get regulars who have been coming since the first year and tell us they can taste the difference when the humidity changes. That part of the business remained intact, and I needed that more than I can say. What changed was the architecture underneath it. I no longer let one person be the sole authority on anything I cannot personally verify. I made myself learn more about the financial side of the business than I ever wanted to know, not because I suddenly love accounting, but because I understand now that ignorance is expensive in ways no entrepreneur should treat casually. I know what our gross margins should look like in different seasons. I know where to check for irregularities. I know what questions to ask when someone says a transfer is temporary or a category is slightly off. Those skills are not a replacement for trust. They are the infrastructure that makes trust safe. People sometimes ask whether I ever imagined Garrison would go to prison. The honest answer is that at first I could not imagine anything clearly enough to answer. Then, once the evidence was in place, I wanted accountability more than spectacle. I wanted restitution. I wanted the books cleaned up. I wanted his lies named correctly. I wanted the court to see that this was not a mistake or an opportunistic theft, but a deliberate scheme carried out over years. Prison was the result of that. I did not need to celebrate it to believe it was deserved. I did not get my money back in full. I did get my company back in full, or as close to full as a company can be after that kind of violation. I got my confidence back in pieces. I got a better system. I got the relief of knowing the winter that had hurt me so badly had been artificially darkened by someone else's greed. I got the stubborn satisfaction of seeing the story line up at last with the real numbers. The thing I return to most often is that first phone call. Not because it was the worst part, but because it was the hinge. If Denise had not called, I might never have known. If the bank had not asked a simple, direct question, Garrison might have continued for years. That is a disturbing thought, but a useful one. It reminds me that fraud does not always unravel because of brilliance. Sometimes it collapses because one person outside the system asks for a number to be explained. I think that is why this story still matters to me beyond the money. It is a story about a bakery, yes. About a woman who built something real with her own hands and then discovered the person guarding the ledgers had been quietly feeding on it. But it is also a story about the strange way a lie survives in daylight. It survives through familiarity, through routine, through the assumption that if nobody has raised a hand, then there must not be anything to see. Garrison counted on all of that. He counted on me being busy, grateful, and too occupied with actual operations to audit the story he wrote for me. He was wrong, eventually. It just took a bank officer, a forensic accountant, and 2 months of patient work to prove it. Every now and then I pass the filing cabinet in the back office at the original bakery. It is small, unremarkable, and almost invisible to anyone who does not know what it holds. Inside are the monthly reconciliation reports from the new firm, the ones I review before the month ends. It is a minor thing, a boring thing, a thing no one would photograph or celebrate or turn into a headline. But I think the quiet habits are where real repair lives, not in revenge, not in dramatic speeches, in the ordinary decision to keep checking. If there is any comfort in what happened, it is that the truth did finally get to exist on paper. And now, when I look at the business I built from one storefront and a family recipe, I do not just see what was taken. I also see what remained. I see the staff who stayed loyal. I see the customers who kept coming. I see the systems that now force light into the places where darkness used to hide. I see the version of myself who was willing to believe the numbers until the numbers themselves refused to stay consistent. I still feel angry when I think about the years I lost to someone else's greed. I think I probably always will. But anger in this case did not consume me. It clarified me. It made me more exacting, more careful, and less willing to confuse friendliness with integrity. That may be the most practical outcome of all. Because in the end, Garrison did not just steal $640,000. He stole time. He stole certainty. He stole the years in which I might have made different choices if I had known the truth. But he did not get to keep the story. Now the story belongs to the real numbers, the real records, and the real people who held the line while I figured out what had happened in my own office. Trust is still possible. It just has to be earned in a way the books can prove. That betrayal changed my life, but it did not get the final word. The truth did.